Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back to your flipped classroom in our continuing discussion of French society leading up to the French Revolution, right? So we spent a lot of time today, in class, reviewing the American Revolution stuff, also talking about, of course, who you would want to survive the zombie apocalypse with if you had to pick a teacher at school. And another big thing that we discussed as well is the lead up to this entire thing, talking about the divisions of their society, the social classes that exist in France underneath the ancient regime, aka the feudal system at the time. And then we also spent a lot of time talking about the personalities of the rulers that they have in charge, right? Why did we spend so much time discussing Louis XVI and his little weird idiosyncrasies? Why did we talk about why he loves locks and how his marriage didn't go very well, and that Marie Antoinette was his wife, the very famous queen Marie Antoinette was his wife, and stuff like that? Why do we talk about them so much? To mainly just show you that these odd birds that are going to be ruling over France, well, Marie Antoinette's not that odd. She does really have just a tragic life story, though. But the big thing about it, though, when we're looking at it, we talk about them a lot so you can get to know them, right? So you can get to know them, and going into the revolution, you will see somebody in your mind when we discuss them, right? So you'll get to know them a little bit better and be able to relate to them as the events of the revolution unfold, right? But where we left off in class, we left off talking about the estates of the ancient regime, right? We talked about the clergy, of course, being the first estate. We talked about the second estate being the nobility. And now those first two estates pay little to nothing in taxes. Well, the first estate pays nothing in taxes, and the second estate pays almost nothing in taxes. And they're also in charge of collecting taxes, which is really, really screwed up, right? And then going into it, then we last left off talking about, of course, who's in the third estate, but, everybody else.
Give it back now, you don't get none. Everybody in the club get Texas.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the big thing about it, though, you need to understand is that the third estate is made up of very different kinds of people, right? It is everyone else. It is everybody else. It is everybody else in French society falls into the third estate. Now, if you've been paying pretty good attention, you're like, wait a minute, but there's not that many clergy members. There's probably not that many nobles. So is third estate massive? Yes, the third estate is massive, right? It's like 97% of French society, but they only have about 10% of the country's wealth, right? So the thing about it is in your mind, you're like, well, if it's a lot of people, couldn't they generate a lot of tax revenue? Well, yeah, they do generate a lot of tax revenue, but the thing about it is the nobles and the church are the wealthier ends of things, and they're not paying their fair share. And this could get confusing, though, because here's where everything gets a little weird. Third estate is not one group of people. It's actually three different groups of people, okay? So the thing you need to understand about it is when we're looking at the third estate, it is made up of three different types of people, right? You have your first one that we'll talk about today, which is the bourgeoisie, all right? So, okay, that word right there, very important that we actually say it correctly. It's a very common last name down here, bourgeoisie, all right? So, now, look, the thing about it is when you're saying it in French, you can say bourgeoisie or you can say bourgeois. All right, so either one doesn't really matter. And we'll talk about why that word sounds so fancy here in a second. But also then there's these rural peasants, who's the bulk of the third estate. And then you have the final one, the urban workers, who are going to play a major, major part in this revolution, right? But let's start from the top, going on our way down. In the third estate, the smallest group within the third estate are these members known as the bourgeoisie, right? The bourgeois, if you want to call them that. Whereas the origin of the word bougie, that you know some also as well. If somebody is bougie, it means that they're kind of uppity and stuff like that because they have a little bit more money. Well, the thing about it is that is the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie in the third estate are prosperous bankers. They are merchants. They are lawyers. They are doctors, manufacturers. They are the early middle class of France, even though they are placed in the lowest class of France. Who they are the ones in the third estate that have some money, that have received an education, that have been raised in an environment where they actually have the ability to read, to write, to understand Enlightenment ideas, and to understand the growing want and need of legislative bodies in absolutist France, right? So the bourgeoisie is going to be very important. You could spot a bourgeoisie member on the streets very, very easily because they were dressed a little bit fancier than everybody else in the third estate. Now, an interesting little dynamic about this that some of you are like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, if you were rich enough as a bourgeoisie member or a bourgeois member, couldn't you just buy your way into the nobility and become a robe noble? That's a really, really good question, right? That's a fantastic question, and the answer is you could. But it still was wildly expensive, right? Not every single bourgeois family had that kind of money, if you understand what I'm talking about. So a large number of bourgeois members were forced to stay in the third estate where they paid an obnoxious amount of their money in taxes, right? So the other next thing as well is you have the rural peasants, right? You got the people that live in the countryside, right? Rural, of course, meaning country, and peasant meaning poor, like person or like regular person or whatever. The rural peasants are the bulk of the third estate, okay? They are the biggest mass of people in the third estate. They are farmers, tenant farmers, day laborers, people that work in the old feudal lands for the lords and for the nobles, and they are the workers on those large estates, right? So they are pretty important, but they're not as important as the next group, the urban workers, right? The urban workers are the people that live in the cities who are the poorest member of the third estate. They are the very, very bottom, and they are like the unemployed, the street vendors, the printers. They work in early factories, right? All these other different locations, but they are the poor that dwell in the cities, right? Now, the interesting thing about it is when this revolution does really get kicked off, it's going to be a lot of bourgeois members joining up with urban workers to actually create this revolution. The rural peasants have their role. They do have their role. They have a massive role in this as well, but not quite like the bourgeois and the urban workers do, right? You need to make sure you highlight all three of those names: bourgeois, rural peasants, urban workers, because that's a really big question, right? Knowing who lives in the first estate, who's in the second estate, and who's in the third estate, you got to know those going into the test, and it's also really important for just understanding this revolution, period. Well, the next thing you need to understand, though, is the concept of why this whole system is so unfair. The first and second estate pay almost nothing in taxes. The first estate pays absolutely nothing. The second estate pays very little amounts of taxes, right? Only on land and salt traditionally. And then also going forward with it as well, the second estate also collects all those taxes. So they could actually jack the taxes up, skim off the top, steal little bits and pieces of it if they so chose, but they were making money off the collection of taxes themselves. So the thing about it is the third estate is wicked upset about this, right? They're very, very upset about this because they're like, you don't understand how unfair this is. Because the third estate pays taxes on everything from soap to salt to tobacco to anything and everything they must purchase is going to be taxed, right? Now, something really, really important that we need to go ahead and get out of the way is that actually when a lot of other history teachers teach this, they actually teach it along the lines of this very basic belief that when the French Revolution breaks out, that it's going to be the third estate versus everybody else. And it actually isn't that true. There were members of the first and second estate that believed that this was a problem, right? They believed it was a problem, and so they came together with the third estate and actually fought for more rights and trying to actually limit the absolute power of the monarchs and trying to fix the financial crisis that was going on in France, okay? Big, big figures that we'll talk about, of course, include one very famous noble that you know of very well, known as the Marquis de Lafayette, who actually the city of Lafayette is named after him, right? And we'll also talk about a couple of other famous priests as well and things like that were in the first estate that also believed in the cause of the third estate and actually making this revolution go forward. But the big thing you need to also understand about it, though, is that this whole thing, all these problems with taxation, all these problems with representation, all these problems with all these different ideas going on is happening right during the time of the Enlightenment, right? When you got people like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Diderot, okay, like Denis Diderot, Baron de Montesquieu, John Locke, all these guys writing all these ideas down about the Enlightenment, being like, you know what? Governments have too much power. And we believe that legislative bodies need to be in every single country. And absolutism is a terrible idea. The people of France in the Third Estate are going to be reading these ideas. And so Enlightenment ideas are beginning to spread. They're beginning to pilfer their way into French society. And when you look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas of emotion and emotional exuberance and living out in the woods and how we need to adopt the general will of society and be able to vote on all these different key ideas and ideals and things going forward, it's going to make a lot of people in France be like, you know what, Jean-Jacques? You're right. We need to have a revolution to overthrow this noise, right? The thing about it, though, too, that you need to understand is that the Enlightenment is spreading in a very, very aggressive way just due to the fact that it's actually the inspiration for revolutions, right? Now, the next couple of things on this, a lot of you are like, oh my God, there's so much to write. Calm down. Cut it down a little bit, right? Maybe focus on the fact that I bolded a couple of words here that you need to make sure you know, okay? So the Enlightenment is going to have major effects, though, on the revolutionary process because it inspires them, right? The writings of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Montesquieu, Locke, all these other different figures, Adam Smith, who talked down about mercantilism and said we should not be paying taxes on just goods from our country. There should be a free market where you can buy anything you so choose without the government tampering with those things, are going to inspire people to get angry and real feisty. And where are they hearing about these ideas? A lot of y'all are like, oh, is this where the cheap written materials comes into play? That's a part of it, all right? So there are cheaper written materials and literacy rates are at an all-time high, but another big thing you need to understand about it is that the Enlightenment almost became like a social thing you did, right? The Enlightenment became like the it thing. All the cool kids were listening to Enlightenment ideas during the 1700s. And you would go to places to hear about these Enlightenment ideas. If you were wealthy, possibly like a lower noble or a bourgeois family that had enough money, you would go to a place called a salon, right? A salon, not a salon like where you go get your hair done, right? Where you sit under the big dryers and stuff like that, like they do in Beauty School Dropout in Greece. Like not like that, okay? Which I usually shout out some of y'all. I know that some of y'all are really big fans of Greece and whatnot. The big thing about it is not a salon like that. We're talking about a salon that actually looks like this. Salon, 1700s. All right, so what you're going to see, though, is wealthy people meeting up in a very large thing known as a drawing room, right? These beautiful, gorgeous drawing rooms in these French households where there would just be paintings all over the entire walls with these golden frames along the outside. And wealthy women would actually hold these parties, and they would invite Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers to come into them and debate one another while everyone else sat around the outside and listened to these debates, right? Voltaire could be sitting in the same room as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and they would be discussing the different ideas on how to create a better and more perfect society. Or people would come and try to debate people like Voltaire in front of others and stuff like that, and these Enlightenment ideas began to spread, right? Now, the interesting modality about this, though, as well, is it just rich people in this room? No, y'all. Think about it. When you're a wealthy person, you probably have servants, butlers, workers that are pilfering around the room a little bit, moving items, doing these little things. They're also hearing what is being said at these salons, and they're taking these ideas with them as well, and they're going out into public spaces, and they're sharing what they have heard with their fellow man, right? They're going into places like coffee houses, which became very popular in England, because they teemed with ideas on how monarchs abuse their power and stuff like that, because they had heard these different ideas at salons, right? Coffee houses, though, were more for the middle class and the lower classes, but without the Enlightenment, there would be no revolutions, right? And speaking of revolutions in general, which one was directly inspired by the Enlightenment and is the Enlightenment in action? It's none other than the American Revolution, right? The French are going to aid the Americans with money and troops, and the American Revolution was directly inspired by the Enlightenment. You could argue that Thomas Paine himself, the guy that wrote Common Sense, that I forgot to put in the warm-up apparently, is going to be in the warm-up on this next one, is actually could be considered an Enlightenment thinker. His idea being like, you know what, it is common sense that we break away from Great Britain, right, and have a revolution and become a country all of our own, right? You could argue that Benjamin Franklin is an Enlightenment thinker as well, and also the people of France were just so obsessed with him, right? Putting his face on tea towels and medallions and stuff like that. You could go to France during this time period, and the French people were so impressed with the French Revolution, or the American Revolution, they were like, oh my God, the Americans, they are the best. And Benjamin Franklin, he is like their poster child. He is the best. That they would like buy things with his face all over it all the time. So much so that actually Louis XVI, that we met today in class, got so annoyed with seeing his face everywhere that he had Benjamin Franklin's face painted in the bottom of his chamber pot, which is where he went to the bathroom every day, which is really kind of an insult to Benjamin Franklin. But you know what, Louis XVI? Wait till you get yours, because it's going to happen, right? But the big thing you need to understand about it, though, is the French are actually going to aid the Americans. Now, it wasn't Louis that actually aided the Americans. Oh, wait, no, it was Louis. Louis XVI gave money to the Americans so they could fight against the British. Because remember, what was one of the biggest holdovers from the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War is that the French and the English came out of this thing as heated rivals with one another, right? So the French actually aided the Americans breaking away from the British because in their mind, the French were like, oh, the Americans, when they create a stable economic system, will actually trade with us more exclusively, and we can use them to make large amounts of money as well to get us out of this war debt. Problem is that the American Revolution doesn't even end until 1783. The French Revolution starts in 1789, right? So it was a good idea, it was a great bet, but it just didn't have enough time to kind of matriculate, right? French soldiers and French people were directly inspired by the American Revolution and the ideas of the American Revolution that Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin had actually put forward. And do I not have this man's name on here? Oh my God, what am I doing? One of the most famous figures that was inspired by this is none other than this man right here. Write his name down. The Marquis de Lafayette. Okay, the Marquis de Lafayette, also known as Gilbert, just write this part right here. The Marquis de Lafayette is actually a very famous figure. Of course, you know the city of Lafayette is named after him, right? So the thing about it, though, is he's so important because he actually came over and he fought in the American Revolution for the Americans to help them break away from Great Britain. And the Marquis de Lafayette was so inspired by the concepts of American liberty and American freedom and American life in American, everything that they were breaking away to create and start a brand new country based in Enlightenment ideals, that Marquis de Lafayette was like, I am so blown away by all this. He absolutely loved George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, but he liked George Washington so much and was so inspired by George Washington that he actually named his son George Washington Lafayette. And when the French Revolution starts, the Marquis de Lafayette starts collecting little things to like send back to the Americans like George Washington to be like, look, man, Look at what we're doing. We're doing it too. We're having a revolution all of our own, right? So the American Revolution serves as a direct inspiration for the French Revolution and actually really, really push forward the ideas of growth, of liberty, of freedom, and of the Enlightenment. But what's going to end up happening, though, is the most direct cause of the French Revolution is the terrible financial situation of France. I have read an 1,000-page book about the French Revolution called Citizens, and it's by a Harvard author named Simon Schama. And the amount that this guy talks about how the financial situation of France could have been easily fixed but wasn't easily fixed and led directly to the revolution is bananas. The guy literally talks about it for at least 400 pages of that book, being like, well, you know, like there was a revolutionary spirit and stuff like that, but man, oh man, French didn't have any money, which is going to be one of the biggest leading causes of this entire revolution, right? And a lot of their financial troubles were caused by a very important concept, right? It's this thing known as deficit spending, right? So the French government at this time, sorry, needed a sip of coffee. Now, the thing about it is the French government had actually like fallen into this pattern known as deficit spending, right? And deficit spending, what it is it's spending money you don't have, right? It's kind of like spending money on a credit card, right? Credit card money's not real. It's going on credit, right? You're like swiping your card, going into it being like, I hope this works out, and I hope I make enough money to pay this whole thing off. Because every single time the French would do anything, every time they go to war under Louis the 15th or 14th, they had to borrow money to do that, right? Every time that they would actually like create trade negotiation deals, they had to borrow money to do that. Every time they wanted to build something, they had to borrow money to do that or use tax revenue. So they were going into debt. And national debt in France was at an all-time high. I don't think you understand just how high it was because the wars and helping the Americans and stuff like that forced the government to borrow money. Now, a lot of you do not understand how loans work, and it's really, really depressing, all right? But the thing about it is when you borrow money from someone, they typically charge you interest, right? Interest is money you have to pay to them that doesn't even go for paying off your loan. For example, let's say hypothetically I borrowed $100 from one of y'all in class, right? The fact that y'all have $100, I'm a little skeezed out about, but the fact that you have it and I'm going to borrow it, is what it is. So the thing about it, though, in general, is France is going through this borrowing money issue, right? But let's say I borrowed $100 from one of y'all, and you were like, look, you got to pay me back, like, all right, within, I don't know, X amount of time. But what we're going to do is every single week that you don't pay it back, whatever you have left over, you owe me 10% on top of that. That's interest, right? So in the long run, if it took me 3 weeks to pay it off, I could end up owing you somewhere in the neighborhood, not of $100, but of like $150 because of the interest that's tacked onto it, right? The French debt was so bad, that 50% of all the tax money that they were collecting was paying interest on the debts. So it wasn't even paying the debts off. It was just paying the fees that they had accrued to borrow the money in the first place, right? That is awful. If you have a financial situation like that, your country is going to descend into revolution, into revolt, and you have no hope of coming out of it. It's just very realistic, right? This is why you don't borrow all that money. Just don't do it, promise? And also, on top of everything else, not including the fact that the 50% tax revenue issues are happening and that the government is frantically trying to figure out ways to fix that, but also there are really bad harvests sweeping throughout all of France. The food costs are up, leaving the poor with very, very little money. The first and second estate are still refusing to pay more in taxes, right? So the thing about it is, Louis back, is against the wall. Louis the 16th is like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. He went through like 3 or 4 different financial advisors, right? One was named Turgot. One was named Cologne. One was named, what's the other one's name? Starts with a B. All right, so like, Barignac. Yeah, like, so like they went through all these different figures that were like, well, what if we do this? Or what if we do that? Or what if we do this? That all had great ideas, but everybody was just so anti-government at this point that they refused to do them. And then enter in the most famous of all the financial advisors, a man by the name of Jacques Necker. Neker, all right? So Jacques shows up, and he's a Swiss financial advisor. He goes up to Louis, and he says, big fella, I hate to break this to you, but you got to do what you never wanted to do, all right? You've got to call the Estates General, right? And the Estates General is a massive council of representatives from each estate, and they meet up all about financial reform. It's basically an emergency parliament, right? Where basically the estates elect local representatives from each estate, and they all assemble inside of Versailles all together. And the sad part about it is the Estates General hadn't met since 1614. This is a sign of how awful the financial times are in France, right? Because when the Estates General meets, they have a couple of key goals, right? They want to create fairer tax laws for the Third Estate. They want to solve the financial crisis, but everything goes wrong on the first day. The first day of the Estates General. There are giant glaring shenanigans. There's problems. Each estate only got 1 vote. We're going to explain all the headaches of the Estates General in class when I see y'all when you come back, okay? So I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. Just remember, the Estates General, it's back, it's bad, and it's not going to be the best idea. But I'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.